So thank you all also for joining us on this very sunny afternoon. So my name's Nick Brown, and I'll be chairing today's seminar and introducing our speaker, Dr. Kadija George-Sese. I'll just quickly do a little bit of housekeeping. So this session is being recorded, and there'll be time for questions at the end. If you prefer not to be recorded asking your question, please pop your questions into the chat and we can ask it on your behalf, and we'll get through as many questions as time allows for. Just to get my own introduction quickly out the way, I'm a librarian who's worked at many cultural institutions, including having had the privilege of working at the Stuart Hall Library at Inova in London. Inova is the Institute of International Visual Arts. If you don't know it, I would encourage you to check it out. It's an absolutely wonderful place. And I'm also about to be commencing a PhD looking at successive generations of Black British artists and their relationship with independent publishing and print culture. So lots of crossover with Kadija George's research. And in fact, as I've been researching my topic, Kadija's name kept coming up. Often I'd find that she'd written something hugely knowledgeable about almost any aspect of Black British writing or publishing that I might be delving into. So it's genuinely a great honour for me to be introducing Kadija today. I'm going to read out Kadija's bio. It's a very substantial bio, so I'm going to read it because otherwise I won't remember everything worth mentioning. So Dr. Kadija George-Sese has worked in book and periodical publishing for several years. She published Sable Lit for 15 years until 2015, when she started her PhD. She is the publications manager for Inscribe, the Black British Writers Development Programme at People Tree Press, for which she has commissioned a series of poetry and fiction anthologies. The latest will be the forthcoming Glimpse anthology, which is the first anthology of Black British speculative fiction, and it's going to be edited by Leonie Ross, and I'm really excited about that, as well as the forthcoming Afrofuturism exhibition at the Hayward. I think those things really nicely connect. The Afro Poetry Selection interactive video app that she has created is a digital anthology of African poetry and Pan-Africanism. She has also co-edited several other anthologies and is co-author with Professor Joan Aminado and Dr. Deirdre Osborne of This is the Canon, Decolonize Your Bookshelf in 50 Books. That's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it to everyone. Kadija was awarded her doctorate from Brighton University, where she researched Black British publishers and Pan-Africanism from 1960 to 1980. For her current early career research fellowship in inclusion, participation and engagement at the School of Advanced Studies, she will be researching Black British magazines between 1990 and 1999, collecting qualitative data using oral history methods. So this event is in some ways a welcome to Kadija to the School of Advanced Studies. She is a member of the African Literature Association, ASWAD, and a board member on the African Studies Association UK. She was a Kluge Research Fellow at the Library of Congress in 2019, and since then has been awarded an MBE and an Honorary Fellowship by Goldsmiths College for services to literature, and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. So I think the length of that biography just gives you a hint of just how much Kadija has achieved, and I would just say that she's leaving out about half of her publications and her own wonderful poetry writing. I was sort of planning to say something a little bit about a phrase that comes up on Kadija's biography often about literary activism, but I think just in the interest of time, I just want to skip over that a little and just say that Kadija's an amazing force for good in the world. And today, Kadija will be talking about her research into the presence of Pan-Africanism in two lifestyle magazines from the 1960s to the mid-1980s. And the title of the talk is Black British Magazines Posed for Their True, in quotation marks, African Nature. With that, thanks very much, and I'll hand it over to Kadija. So you're on mute, Kadija.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for that great introduction. And just as you said, once you said the title, now I know why I said the title as it was. I couldn't work it out, but now I know. Yes, because I just really feel like the true nature of some of the magazines, even though they're Black British, is really one of Pan-Africanism, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so my presentation on Black British magazines this afternoon, and as I said, posed for their true African nature, examines the presence of Pan-Africanism in two Black British magazines from the second half of the 20th century, and that's Tropic and Staunch. I'll be showing details of their content from their editorials, readers' letters, and a selection of articles. And at the end, I'll consider the commonalities between the two, which highlights the Pan-African notions within them and the reasons for them taking this direction. These are just two of the magazines that I researched for my doctorate that were produced during the post-war period, but operated in a similar fashion, such as Asia and Africa Review, West India Digest, and the suite of magazines published by IC Publications, such as New Africa, which is still being published today. Although both magazines had Caribbean-born publishers, they prioritized promoting Pan-African thought and action through their printed mediums. So this is just an image of a couple of them, of Staunch and Tropic. The first issue of a magazine usually sets out its objectives for its readership in the editorial, or it may take a few issues to disclose its intentions, during which time language may also change, particularly magazines that are not set up for commercial benefit. Tropic was launched in 1960 as an A4 monthly lifestyle and current affairs periodical. It signaled a new beginning and a new era when people of African descent arrived in Britain post-World War II. Tropic used different sections within the publication to implement the Pan-African sentiment to a readership that had newly arrived from countries where people had the same ethnic heritage, yet due to the dysfunction caused by the discontinuity that resulted from colonialism, they knew little about each other. What they did know was usually myth, which emphasized the dysfunction reinforced by the divide and rule tactics of colonialism. The first aspect of a magazine, just go to the next one. The first aspect of a magazine that it's experienced is going to be the cover. Tropic featured women of different shades of Black, different hairstyles and dress. The lifestyle design covers of Tropic were always of a Black woman or girl child from different countries. In some ways, they wanted to emulate the lifestyle magazines on the newsstands, and Edward Scobie, the editor, had worked for the Black-owned Johnson Publishing Company in the US and had worked on Ebony and Jet lifestyle magazines, and so is likely to have had some experience of what worked to attract readers. From the July issue, which is that one with Diane Carroll, that's the third along, the one with Diane Carroll. From that issue, the cover included 3 cover lines that addressed aspects of diaspora stories that were featured. So on issue 7, for example, despite it being a special issue for Nigeria, so that is one of the ones below, the figure with the Nigerian headdress, the magazine wanted to draw attention to its African diasporic nature of the magazine. So there's an article that is on it mentions on the cover line about Rastafari by Professor Sylvia Winter, a leading Jamaican academic, and an entertainment article on African-American singer Eartha Kitt. So between the image of the Nigerian woman and the 2 cover lines, there are representations of Africa, Black Britain, Caribbean, and the African-American diaspora. Stories, this might be a little bit small, but there's going to be another one following this that might be a little bit better to read. Stories were included in each issue that were concerned with independence and the development of new nations in Africa and the Caribbean, and features on African diasporic life in Britain that reflected Africa, the Caribbean, and in less depth, Black America. So the first 2 columns will show the number of, this is from the first issue, for example, 4 stories that focused on Africa, and 4 stories that focused on the West Indies. And then you've got about 8, there's about 8 there on Black Britain, and just 1 on America, on African Americans. And then there's a couple of general pieces as well. So this would be kind of typical of how an issue would be split up content-wise. So this one shows a little bit better just in terms of the percentage of the magazine, of how that was split up. So almost 50% from Britain, 90% African, and there's general. So the general would be things like would be, for example, something maybe to do with fashion or something like that. Something was not a specific story to do with a specific region. Tropic was owned by two Jamaican businessmen, although it was Edward Scobie as editor-in-chief who drove its content. Scobie had been the editor for Checkers, which was published in 1948, just a few years after the Pan-African Congress in 1945. Although there's no evidence to show that Scobie attended the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, from his journalistic work, he does seem to have been inspired by it, which motivated him to want to unify the masses under a Pan-African banner. Sections within Tropic played specific roles towards building unity. In particular, these were the editorials, most of which were mouthpieces to address Pan-Africanism as an ideal. Other sections, such as the letters page and Tropicana, a digest page, People in the News, reinforced the subtle way in which Pan-Africanism was included for its readership to embrace, discuss, and act upon. Scobie's editorial influence is evidenced by his tone, language, and content of the editorial that were statements in opposition to colonialism and in support of independence for all colonized countries, as well as advocating the concept of Pan-Africanism. The first issue in March 1960 was timed to coincide with the launch of the anti-apartheid movement and the start of a year that had 17 African countries gaining their independence. So this is the editorial page of that first issue. And in the first editorial, we'll read phrases such as, whilst Fleet Street journalists were heralding a decade of outer space exploration, the people of Africa and the West Indies were shaking themselves free of the fetters of Whitehall. It was the decade of Black independence. So that immediately kind of to show you the different interests of the parties, even though they were all in Britain, the very interest as far as people of African descent was concerned, was about independence, not about the space race. And that photo at the top shows that first meeting, that first public meeting of gathering for anti-apartheid in Trafalgar Square. The editorial in issue 4 linked negritude and Senghor to Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. So here I've just copied the first bit, or a section of that editorial. Dr. Nkrumah has something larger in mind when he speaks of an African personality, where he is sharing a vision with millions of his fellow Africans, the dream of a continent of people shaping out their own destiny and a distinct way of life, expressing a personality that is unmistakably and unashamedly African. The consummation of the dream of an African personality, a proud and positive negritude, will undoubtedly be in the foundation of the United States of Africa, either as a federation or loosely knit association. Tropic wanted to make sure that their readership knew of Nkrumah's words and intentions, and also the progress which this meant by embracing Pan-Africanism. There was so much excitement and energy bursting out of this first editorial that was not just about producing a magazine, but was also about the spirit and energy of our independence, and reminding readers and other members of the public that not everything that was happening in relation to anti-apartheid was white-led. The next, I'm showing another editorial page here. Whoops, I'll just move that one back again. And this one was, I think this was issue 6. But this is looking at another side of what coming together in unity of Pan-Africanism meant, because this was an office, the office of Tropic was smashed in a racist attack. And they used that incident to remind people that Black people were being attacked all over the world. It wasn't just in South Africa with anti-apartheid. It wasn't just the other, what was happening in America, because we hadn't yet got to the main Black power time, but still in terms of what was happening in America and the atrocities that were happening there. So this was just a reminder, even though nobody was hurt in this attack, that Black people are attacked wherever they are, especially when they're living in a host society. Tropicana, so another section which was used quite a lot. So you're going from a cover which you're attracted to immediately, And then immediately on the inside cover, we have this, what I've called a digest, because it is a collaboration of smaller pieces, called Tropicana, People in the News. The content was a mix of high achievers in the different fields of art, entertainment, professional bodies and politicians from Africa and the African diaspora. This was very typical. These were very typical pages for Tropicana, People in the News. It reinforced for its Black readership the diversity of Black talent and social backgrounds of whom would eventually be part of Nkrumah's United States of Africa, all of whom had their roots in Africa despite the route which they had left or returned. Tropicana usually appeared on the inside front cover, consisting of 4 to 6 captioned photos. In issue one, for example, the first photo is of the young Kenyan political activist, Tom Mboya, seen as a founding father of Kenya and an independent activist. In issue 2, the lead photo is one of the 3 designs of the new Ghanaian stamp, which is that one at the end. That's the Tropicana page at the end, and the stamp is right in the top left-hand corner. That showed 15th of April as African Freedom Day. 6 other photos of deep captioning were included on this page, with one of the photos, bottom right, of Charles Ross, the co-publisher of Tropic, with the commercial attaché of the Ghana High Commission at the launch party of Tropic the previous month. The publishers and editorial team ensured that they befriended and socialized with the achievers whose causes they supported, and also those same people would be supporting the magazine. In issue 7, although October was a special Nigerian issue, the leading issues in the Tropicana section were not, as would be expected, just be Nigerian. One was of Andrew Sorky, and you can see that in the first page right there, reported as being a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellow from the States that would enable him to travel to West Africa to study Anansi folktales. Anansi weaves Ghana and Jamaica together through literature, oral history, and culture, as they both have the same Anansi folktales. Sorky, with subsequent publishers, interpreted research in the form of stories. Anansi Score, with Bogle Overture Publications, one of the first Black book publishers of the 1960s. A third section to note how the publishers engaged and encouraged their readers in Pan-African ideas were the readers' letters pages through discussions on identity and language, which created much debate. There were other things they discussed, but the ones on language and identity were really hot topics. Scobie used Tropic to help readers better understand the issues created by double consciousness and discontinuity created by colonialism. Letters from readers revealed the breadth of the geographical spread of Tropic and the subjects that were of interest, as well as reactions to the matters raised. Their aim, to stand for coloured people everywhere in their struggle for independence, was reiterated in the introduction on the letters pages. In the second issue, they reinforced that they were not anti-white, but unashamedly pro-Black. The role of the letters page, whether those letters were genuine or not, as has been suggested that they were often created in-house, became another method employed by the editorial team to create a space for Black people to discuss and clarify misunderstandings about each other. From issue 2, when the letters page started, Tropic presented themselves as being concerned primarily with the affairs of Caribbean, East and West Africans of Negro origin in Cardiff, Birmingham, London, Monrovia, Lagos, Freetown, Accra, or in the Rhodesias, Kenya, Port of Spain, Kingston, or wherever you may choose to mention, and they will proudly continue to use the word coloured throughout the magazine. Letters provided the publishers with a way in which to reinforce the aims, objectives, and ideology of the magazine. In the last letter of the last issue, Mr. Danso Manu states the matter that each person from the colonies needs to address in order to move past the disingenuous attitude that people in the African diaspora show each other. So I've just put a part of this letter, quote from that letter here. We should blame the colonial system of education, which we all endured at school. This system conditions you to look down on your cultural background and to look up to the mother country for inspiration and guidance. The letters page was also an activist tool, yet at the same time ensured that the readers also engaged with and purchased the magazine. With such an audience, they could then introduce concepts to advance ideals that they believed the Black community needed in order to forge better future relations with each other, particularly living within the host society. Using terms such as equality of the races reinforced that Pan-Africanism was being used by the Tropic editorial as a term for unity. Finally, I'll mention a sample, as regards Tropic, I'll mention a sample of the topic of the articles to show how they were used to discuss and act on Pan-Africanism. One of the Tropic featured artists who rendered the concept and commitment to Pan-Africanism closest was Nambu Roy, a maroon sculptor living in Britain whose work evolved through African expressions. His cultural identity immediately distinguished him not only as a roots man born and bred in Jamaica, but more importantly, his proud identification as a maroon descendant. Roy's work reflected his knowledge in his roots, as does his name. His self-identification as a maroon is in the title and first line of the story. More than any other Negro artist, he has elevated the once despised carvings of the African race to high repute among art connoisseurs all over the world. Carving, says Nambu Roy, has been in my family for about 240 years, ever since a male ancestor was taken as a slave from the Congo to the West Indies, in fact. He projected his work at his position as one who contributed to Africa's social reconstruction, as closely identifying himself and his work with Africa. Roy exhibited through his character and work how African art moved from being referred to as primitive to show an unmistakable and unashamedly Africanness of the mask that he chose to sculpt to emphasize the pride in his heritage. So in the middle, you can see there Nambu Roy with two of his children, one of whom I believe is Jacqueline Roy, the writer. So, because I just sent her this, so I'm not sure if one of these is her, but this was her father. Other visual artists included in Tropic were sculptors and photographers such as Ronald Moody and his concrete sculpture of Johannan, an early work that reflected an inner conflict of the soul not yet resolved. The Tropic critics saw in this the unreconciled nature of W.E.B. Du Bois's Two Souls. In terms of the entertainment section, there were two stories that appeared on trumpeter Louis Armstrong. One was called Entertainment in Ghana, which provided a brief account of traditional cultural activities and featured the visit of trumpeter Louis Armstrong when he went there in 1956. He followed this with a tour in 1960, referencing and making links between the two musical art forms of jazz and Ghana's traditional music, including such a feature emphasizing historical, cultural links to African roots through music. The subsequent influences between Ghana's cultural heritage and those outside, and later, the influence that artists such as Armstrong brought to musicians on the continent. Although his first visit was as an ambassador for the USA, his second visit in 1960 was that of an African musician returning home, featured in an article called Satchmo in Africa. Stories and actions by internationally renowned celebrities such as these encouraged those of African descent to see themselves in the same Pan-African trajectory. Those who wrote for Tropic and what they wrote about was equally motivating. It was a method that Scobie employed, which was to have writers from the Caribbean contribute articles that would resonate with all people of African heritage. Creative writers such as Guyanu Jean Carew wrote non-fiction for Tropic, and two pieces were published on the Congo, The Truth About the Congo and Carew's essay, Independence for 13 Million Africans, explained the complicated realization of political independence in that region. His article was a strong opinion piece that showed how European colonizers had systematically brutalized African people physically and mentally to create enough fear in the people for them to proceed in physically destroying the country more easily too. Carew's article was hopeful and prophetic at the same time, with its last line being, "We all look to the Congo to prove that these age-worn prophecies are untrue," and which of course we know that didn't happen. It was another tactic to inform readers that the Congolese story was important to all Black people and that its relevance went past the borders of the continent and held lessons for those preparing for independence. It also evidenced the demeaning treatment of the ex-colonies by ex-colonizers, emphasizing that the situation linked all people of African descent, subtly indicating that this could also happen to them. Peru's opinion piece drew attention to surreptitious involvement that there would be some native leaders in the changeover to independence who were not to be trusted, as they fronted the interests of colonial institutions rather than those of their own people. These careful selections were designed to connect their diasporic leadership to the oneness of Pan-Africanism. Tropic concluded an excerpt from George Laming's Pleasures of Exile in Why We Can't Go Home, which indicated the similarities between African and Caribbean exiles. He also contributed another piece called Columbus in Reverse, which was a political response following the 1959 general election in Britain, won by the Conservative Party led by Harold Macmillan. The title itself is predicated with the sense of Pan-Africanism and can be framed within Paul Gilroy's Roots and Roots discourse as the following excerpt demonstrates. Columbus may be buried, but his journey is still being made. By the phrase Columbus in reverse, I want to suggest that the journey, which started from Europe to the New World of the Caribbean, is now being done for different reasons and by different sailors from the New World of the Caribbean to Europe. There's even a sense in which it is to take the exact route, for so much of the West Indies came out of Africa, and so much of Africa was transformed by the West Indies, and now so much of the West Indies is sailing back to Africa via Europe. Until very recently, for example, Dr. Arthur Lewis was the economic advisor to the Ghana government, and until his deeply lamented death, Mr. George Padmore was a political advisor to Dr. Nkrumah. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge at this point of the deeply lamented death of George Laming earlier this month. Laming was here not only delineating different African diasporas geographically and historically, he also indicated that these groups were in flux and had their own ebb and flow, that Pan-Africanism was not a static concept. Writers also included Tropic also included award-winning journalists, investigative journalists from Drum magazine in South Africa, such as Robert Govender, who eventually became an editor of the Caribbean Times in the UK, published by Hansard Publications, and Bloke Modison, whose work provided stories about South Africans in the township. Tropic served as a mode of communication between the disparate African diasporas in Britain. The subtle method of leading people into the content of the magazine was undertaken initially by the magazine cover, heavy use of high-quality visuals in terms of resolution, aesthetics, and intention. The development of Tropic from the inaugural issue to its final issue highlights how they approached, promoted, and educated people on Pan-Africanism. The Tropicana section appeared to be light content, yet its function was to portray positive narratives of Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, particularly the African diaspora in Britain, as soon as the magazine was entered. Tropicana was a subtle way of educating the mass of the readership and Black population about each other's cultures in a way that they would not necessarily have the opportunity to do so previously, as self-education about their own cultures had been discouraged as unimportant and unnecessary. Although Tropic was only produced for 9 issues, the spirit and energy of independence and freedom ran throughout each one of the magazines. So now I'm going to talk about Staunch, which was published in the 70s. So Staunch was published from 1978 until the mid-80s as an A4 cultural community periodical, which was published every 2 months. It was published by Staunch Poets and Players, a drama group led by Don Kinch and editor of the magazine. As a playwright and dramatist, drama has its role in the magazine in bringing the community together. For Kinch, whose aims and objectives for producing Staunch were about Black self-determination and Black self-help within the community, the magazine illustrated the commonality and unifying message of Pan-Africanism. The title of the magazine itself is reflective of its position and another aspect of Pan-Africanism. In an interview, he said, "For me, it really was more about us talking to each other, finding a way to create vehicles where we could do that comfortably and unashamedly. But again, I didn't think I was doing anything radical. I thought I was doing what was necessary. When I'm thinking about it, it felt like there needed to be something to be grounded, needed to put your feet down but stay there, not shifting. That was behind the name." The content reflects a focus on the creative aspects of what the Black community was undertaking. For Kinch, self-help was reflective of the radicalization of the Black bookshops and publishers in being self-sufficient without being supported by government funds. In their subscription promotions, it provides further information guiding the aims of Staunch. We believe that this magazine is important for a number of reasons, none more so than to give a voice to the Black community and an opportunity to comment on issues which affect the quality of our lives. If we start again by looking at considering the covers, as I did with Tropic, there's a lot more variation here because it lasted for longer, yet they still all do have their purpose. They were still full color. If you notice Tropic, the covers were full color and the inside was black and white. And that is the same with Staunch, nearly publishing 20 years later. And this is very typical of Black magazines that being produced at this time, mainly for cost reasons. Similar to Tropic, women and girl children feature quite strongly. If you look at these covers, for example, if you look at the first one and the third one of the South African woman and the Rastafarian woman, the South African woman wearing a traditional headgear, and then the Rastafarian woman wearing her traditional head wrap, they could almost be interchangeable because their profile is very similar. If you swap their headgear over, even though they're from two different places, it could be the same woman. They're both African women. And then in the center, we have this very distinct one of the young woman with no head wrap. But again, even though she's from an African country, what she is wearing, when you see her with things, for example, like the cowrie shells, which is very much a symbol almost that is used in terms of the African diaspora, you can see that rather than just looking at one cover and thinking about the Pan-Africanism, it's good to look at them over an arc of how they appeared over a few issues or a couple of years in the magazine. And then you can see how that arc of Pan-Africanism took place. Again, you can see this as well in the next one. Oops. With these two girls girl children on the cover. On the right, the little girl has bows which are red, white, and blue, very kind of distinctly Black British. And then in the other one, they are red, gold, and green. So again, that's a very distinctly Ghanaian and Rastafarian. So again, even in these, even though they're apart, again, looking at it an arc, we can see this kind of Pan-African notions coming out even in things like this. And the reason, I think, in terms of having girl children, more than children on the covers in the same way as we saw in Tropic, and also for a magazine I used to write for in America called Class. Part of it was probably not knowing what to have as a cover and asking a friend if they could have their little girl feature on it. But also when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about these children are our future. These are who we're struggling for. These are who we want to unify and bring together. So that is why as well, having faces of children on the cover was again about this, promoting this idea of being together and moving forward in a strong Pan-African sense. This is just a range of the different kind of covers I could have. I wanted to kind of show because they were not always all of them going to be women, but reflection of our social and cultural history, reflecting the interests of the audience that they aim to reach and reflecting their objectives, as each one was a Pan-African image. So like in that yellow cover, we can see it is an image of carnival. It doesn't necessarily say which image of carnival it's from. And in the one at the end, it is of a musician. And I'll talk about that a little bit more because in terms of some of the stories that were told around music. So the image of carnival, for example, may be viewed as pan-Caribbean, but there are also carnivals in Africa. And therefore the image of carnival is reflective of carnivals throughout the diaspora and the continent. Strengthening pan-Caribbeanism was necessary in the UK, as for some people, this step had to be made even before considering a Pan-African one. Arif Ali of Hansard Publications was very aware of this, and he used the influence of his magazines to encourage a Pan-African attitude extremely well. And I often don't think that Hansard Publications are given enough credit for the way that they brought the Black community in Britain together. I also just want to have a look at this first cover, which is very, very interesting. It's clear here seeing the balance on the contents page. You can see here the balance again when I was talking about balance of content, and very strongly creative writing. So we do have right at the top articles, very short articles in this first issue on the community. Then large sections around creative writing called the art, short stories, poems. Then we also have something on the music and reviews. The cover itself is interesting because here's a picture of two hands, which we don't know which color they are. They could be any color. So this is signifying the equality and unity that Staunch were pushing for, but also it's about holding hands, and again, about self-help in the community, one hand holding another hand. As with Tropic, the editorials led on the aims and objectives. Editorials in Staunch were called Staunch Talking, in which the editorial reinvigorated their self-help practice. From its first issue, Staunch lamented the lack of leadership and the lack of unity in the Black community in Britain. So don't forget, as I mentioned, the first issue came out in the late 70s. So this is just pre the unrest that was happening in Britain at the beginning of the 80s, which suggests a reason why they decided to produce a magazine. One of its objectives was for Staunch to be a platform for people to discuss how to progress the Black community. It spoke of exile and migration of communities and noted that not everyone who had migrated wanted to remain in the UK. But how do they return home when there seems to be a lack of understanding and connection with the different country representatives in the High Commissions? Staunch was based in the London Borough of Kensington and often attended events at the Commonwealth Institute, and so was familiar with what was taking place culturally between the Commonwealth countries, as several events took place there. So it's also a mouthpiece for those events. They would often write about the events that happened if they were relevant in terms of the communities and what they were really offering the Black community. On the facing page of that first editorial, and you noted in the contents, there were two short pieces around the community. They were very short pieces, but very impactful. There were two statements. They were more like statements rather than articles because they were like half a page each. One was for the Black community generally, and one was for Black writers. So this is the opening for the first one, which was called Africans and West Indians in the UK. There is this popular fallacy that Africans and West Indians don't get on with one another. The differences between us are the same as those that exist between the Irish and English, the Welsh and English, and the Scots and English. The difference between us are mainly due to the old imperialistic technique, divide and rule, misdirected education and brainwashing from colonial days through education, religion, and other subtle forms. Within this very short piece, it also referenced the Pan-African Congresses, the WASU, which was the West African Students' Union, Padmore and Nkrumah, the Maroons, Marcus Garvey, and it brought it up to date full circle by referencing the education and knowledge of Rastafari that rooted their understanding of what back to Africa meant to him, reminding the rest of the Black community of our commonalities, of their commonalities within people of African descent. At the end of this first piece of writing, it ended with, but our Blackness and brownness general characteristics and pattern of behavior make us one Africans and people of African descent, Black folk. He mentions that term Black folk within the piece as well, in reference to Du Bois's Souls of Black folk. In the bottom half of the same page, they're addressing the Black writer in the UK. It offered the opinion that Black intellectuals who only had white publications and white publishers to write for had the dilemma of not always being able to write as their true self, for their true self. And again, referenced Du Bois, but also referenced Fanon by underscoring them with the reminder that even though they were Black, they had fixing them with the difficulty of their Black skin, white mask position, which they found themselves in. These statements established the objectives of what drove the magazine forward. And so, for example, as has already been mentioned, images and articles on carnival should not be seen as just expressing a specific carnival in a specific country. Other shared cultural attributes were highlighted in further cultural aspects, such as the publishing of recipes, stories on music, and discussions on obeah, both in articles and creative material. These statements in the first issue then become threaded throughout the magazine without having to restate them, as we see the links repeated throughout the issues from here on in. Although Staunch carried extensive features around things that affected the Black community in Britain, such as mental health and the education of the Black child, as earlier I mentioned, a significant portion of Staunch included creative writing. They would have this small square ad that said feature articles, poems, stories, what's on, fashion, recipes, etc. On sale at Foundation, newsagents and bookstores. So it would be sold locally in Kensington, but also we had more bookstores, Black bookstores at the time, and Staunch would be sold at bookstores and local bookstores and Black ones. Including the creative content as the second item reflects the importance of its place in the magazine. Often up to 25% of the magazine consisted of creative writing, poetry, drama, prose, comic strips, and short book reviews written by and for children and adults, interspersed with pencil drawings depicting the creative contents from Rastafari to island scenery. So this is a couple of examples of the spread of the creative writing on these pages. And if you notice on the one on the left-hand side, in fact, on both of them, there's illustrations, the figure, almost like a branding for this section of an individual digger, representing hard work, struggle, and self-help, which reflected what the Black community was feeling in Britain at the time. The themes in the creative writing covered slavery, music, Black life in Britain, Mother Africa, positive Black identity, memories of home, especially Jamaica, and some of these poems would be coming from the Caribbean. They also included poems and other creative work like plays and specific events and incidents from Carnival to Black Lives Lost. In the September-October 1979 issue, for example, a dramatic piece written by school children in East London was about Michael Ferreira, a young Black man who died in a racist attack in East London, with the notorious Stonewall police complicit in his death. This was typical of how staunch poets and players used the medium of drama to discuss Black community issues in the magazine. The focus on the publishing of creative writing was about the messages they shared to encourage creativity within the community, giving equal space to amateurs as well as to seasoned poets. Writing about the state of Black theatre in Britain, as well as the work produced which reflected Black British life, provided Black theatre with a role of telling a layered story of how Black people were seen and treated in Britain that was immediately and seen on stage amongst themselves and with this larger society too. As did a review of the poetry book Member When by Frederick Williams in Patois, at a time when specifying the time that was becoming the Black British period was becoming prominent. Patois often formed part of a Black British person's language, as it did with Rastafari culture, but was also becoming prominent. And its message was that Patois is equally part of a Black British African diasporic future. Articles which appear...
Just to give you about a 5-minute warning.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. Thanks.
Okay, I thought that was behind time. But articles which appeared reinforcing their Pan-African position included a series on music, starting from the first issue in its second year of production, was a series on Grove music, Grove being Ladbroke reggae music produced in Britain. There was a recognition that reggae music coming out of Jamaica was receiving international attention at this time, with the increased popularity of Bob Marley. But there was homegrown reggae music that was not receiving attention, and a series of articles not only about the artists, but the way in which they promoted themselves through marketing and distribution, which they had to do themselves, as they were being ignored by the music industry in the UK, again showing the self-help element of Staunch's objectives. Another topic covered in this series of issues was on Walter Rodney. As a community magazine, it introduces Rodney to an audience who may not have known him. One was titled Why Was Rodney Assassinated, and another, Walter Rodney, Son of Mankind, which spoke to the Pan-African and humanist principles which Rodney embraced. These articles on Rodney were significant to Staunch on 3 levels. Firstly, in the way that the publisher approached Pan-Africanism as being an inclusive one of unity and equality. Secondly, the issue of self-help, and that Black people should support their own initiatives. Rodney had advocated and actioned this with his first book, Rounds with My Brothers, which was published by Global Overture Press, to which he donated his royalties to support a Black self-help publisher. And thirdly, the magazine itself can be seen as a groundings, with the community coming together to discuss what was important for them in order to progress as a community. Magazines, as we've seen, emerge when there is a need, whether it be a campaign or a cultural reckoning, but a distinctive gap that has widened and needs to be filled and answered. Tropic and Staunch emerged during a time and space where gaps were needed to be filled. For Tropic, the time was vibrant and exciting, one that beckoned positively change, but was still a noted sense that the people who should benefit from this new change were not embracing it enough with each other, partly because they'd been made to believe that their beliefs, their feelings, their own dreams, wants, and desires were invalid. They were often given false information about each other, so they could not easily see how they could see themselves supporting each other. A result of colonization, which many people acknowledged and realized that something needed to be done by harnessing the positive energy to turn it into a wind of change. So from 1960 to the end of the 70s, almost 20 years later, it is the generation who were children of the Tropic readers who were then reading Staunch. But it was not a positive energy. It was on the cusp of frustration. And so the aim of bringing people together to survive and thrive in this environment was Staunch's objectives. What they offered was a platform to talk. Both editors Scobie and Kinch were insistent on people talking to each other. Tropic via letters, Staunch often via drama, both printed in their respective magazines. Recognizing that the negative effect of colonization was still one that had to be overcome, and that what Black folks had to unify, and that's what Black folks had to do was to unify, and it was not a second-hand colonial handout, but something in which only they could undertake to nurture themselves, which could be found in Pan-Africanism. So thank you.
That's wonderful, amazing. Thank you, Kadija. That's so rich, so wonderful. So,
I should just mention, if you don't mind, what I'm going to be doing next. So thankfully, I've got this research fellowship at School of Advanced Studies, which is going to enable me to continue doing some research on Black British magazines. So I'm going to be looking at Black magazines in 1990s, which does include, hopefully, Untold, also magazines like Candace magazine and Alarm, for example, and Origin. So I'm going to be doing that early September, I think. So if people want to contact me, they can. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I think because Don Kinch himself does go on to edit and write for other magazines into the 90s, doesn't he?
He does. And at the moment, he's doing his PhD. He's actually focused his practice based on his plays. He did give it up at one stage, and then we were all encouraging him to do it. I think he's just started it this year. So yeah, so he went on to write. He did also publish another magazine. Did I bring it downstairs with me? No, it was called, because he was then moved to Birmingham because he thought that the drama was working for him better in Birmingham, and he did produce other local magazines in Birmingham as well. And then his son became famous, so I take.
Absolutely. That was so rich. That was so wonderful. And there's so much I'd like to dig into in that. Before I do so, if I can invite the audience members, if you want to start putting any questions that you're thinking of into the chat, or I'll also invite people to put their hand up and or unmute in a moment, but I am going to take chair's privilege and ask a first question. But I just thought, so much of what you're saying was so rich about the way that you're kind of reading across the different issues of both of the magazines to kind of bring out both the patterns and the implicit as well as the explicit politics within them. And there's a lot of sort of specific stuff that I really love to dig into. But I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've written elsewhere about this, that I feel like Tropic and Edward Scobie are sort of reasonably well known, that there's sort of secondary writing about it, and Edward Scobie as well, having published Black Britannia well before Peter Fryer, I think he's sort of part of that conversation. Mm-hmm. But Staunch, I feel, is much less known, and I myself have only been able to sort of browse the issues that are available in the Black Cultural Archives. And I wondered, I know you've got a little bit of history about tracking them down yourselves and making them more widely available. And I wondered if you could share some of that story and also just sort of talk about what the fact that those magazines hadn't been collected and made available, how that kind of affects our reading of history and creative practice at that time.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I think, to go back quickly to Tropic, I think Edward Scobie is known more for being the editor of Flamingo. And first of all, I was really deep into Flamingo and loving it, and then realized it wasn't Black owned, so it wasn't included because my definition of a Black publisher is that it had to be Black owned, and Flamingo wasn't. So, and I actually think there's some very, the move from Tropic to Flamingo is still one that kind of myself and another researcher I met are still kind of looking at, because that was really funded by government. What do you call them again? Like MI6 or something like that. Probably for Flamingo, but not so for Tropic. So that's very interesting. So Tropic I don't think is spoken about as much. And if you look at Flamingo, it's not as rich on the Pan-Africanism aspects as Tropic is. And like, for example, the writers like Jan Carew didn't write non-fiction, political non-fiction Flamingo. And people like Robert Govender, all of those drum people, they didn't write for Flamingo. And there's a reason for that, I believe. So it's still, so that's a very interesting magazine. In terms of Staunch, and I think even in terms of a lot of magazines, and you'll know this yourself as a librarian, Nick, they don't always realize, especially when they haven't been trained in that area, but it's something that they're doing because it's needed for the community. They don't all have ISSN numbers on the magazines, and they don't always realize that they need to submit any magazine that is produced or any book that's produced to the British Library. They had no idea they had to do that. So then a lot of the material gets lost. I had some issues of Staunch magazine, for example. I think there's one in the Huntley archives, because I think the one with the Walter Rodney article is in there. And I think maybe the one that I kind of had here that had Ackerbury Huntley's book review. And I think there's some at UWE Mona. I think there's some there. But eventually I found almost a complete set in Manchester at the Ahmed Iqbal Centre. I also went and raided Don Kinch's house in Birmingham. He thought he had them until I literally looked everywhere, and I found a few disparate issues. So the ones that there were doubles of, I took to the British Library because, they just, and, I just checked if they had them, and they didn't have some of those copies, and I just made sure that they had some, and some of the other magazine that he then published. But even those, I only found a couple of copies. So it can be, and, a lot of them are not online. I know there is some kind of website that puts magazines online, but I don't even know how legal that is, because I don't know if they're asking people. Thank goodness I do have quite a few in my garage, because I would work with a lot of these magazines in different areas, either whether it be writing or selling advertising space or doing some other kind of marketing. So I do have some of them, and I'm still in contact with some of the publishers. So that's why I'm just really looking forward to doing this next step of work, because if we don't do this, I mean, a lot of the magazines are seen as ephemera. They're called ephemera, which I really don't think is very fair for magazines, because they really will be telling a story at that time that nothing else will be telling. If there was no black newspaper at the time, those stories won't be told. They're not going to be told in any mainstream press, because either the story isn't big enough or it's just not of interest. Sometimes we have newsletters that get passed around and they get photocopied. That's about it. So there's a very specific and rich part of our cultural history that is going on that gets lost when these magazines disappear. And people are still coming from that sense of, my story isn't that important. So individually, even the individuals are not telling those stories, which is why they're letting the magazines as well just go. And I only actually, when I was doing my research, found mention of some of them in a really a couple of references, and at the best it was just mentioning the titles. That was it.
Absolutely, and I think it does bring home how important that is, that having that collection yourself in the garage, the sort of radical archive of the garage, or someone's radical biscuit tin.
Yeah. It's important. Yeah.
We did have a hand up from Kelly, but unfortunately, I think she's had to go. She's put in the chat, so I'm very sorry that we missed out on her. If I can encourage, if anyone else has questions that they'd like to ask, please to let us know. But Kesewa, please, can I invite you to unmute?
Hi, thank you, Kadija, for a wonderful talk. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I was interested in what you were saying about having deposited rather, copies of the magazines at the British Library when there were doubles. And I kind of wondered how easy that was to do once you had copies of them. Were they quite receptive? Was it quite difficult? Was it a long process? Were you able to store them? And also, it speaks kind of more broadly to some of the things that Nick was suggesting, that some of your work is it's original in lots of different ways, but one of the ways is because you're actually part of the archiving process yourself. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Age me.
No, I mean the fact that you deposed. I mean, a lot of us as historians will use documents that somebody else has collected, but you're actually a part of the process at a much earlier stage. And I wondered if you had any particular. I mean, I describe myself as a historian. I actually didn't catch if you do, if you think of more yourself a literary scholar interested in history, and perhaps that's the difference. Maybe it's more common in your field. I just wonder if you had thoughts and feelings about that, because as you said, if you don't do it, they just get lost, but that does place an extra burden on you as a researcher.
Yes, it does. Let me answer the first question first. In terms of depositing material with the British Library, very easy, very welcoming. And you'll often find there's sometimes there's a radical book fair that used to happen with the book, as Houseman's, I think, used to do it. And usually they would meet somebody there from the British Library hunting for material all the time. So yeah, they were very welcome and very glad to have it. And they just want to make sure they've got all the right information for recording it properly. So that wasn't a problem. In terms of the second bit of your question, I might need to ask you just to clarify that for me for a bit, because I wasn't too sure about exactly what you were asking me. So can you just repeat that, please?
It's probably more of a comment than a question. But I was just trying to avoid saying this is a comment, not a question. But I'm just thinking about. I think I've done it myself in a probably a different sort of way. But when you're using older source material that isn't already catalogued, you end up being somewhat a custodian of it and responsible for making sure it does get catalogued. Yes, and I wondered if you have thoughts on that, but it can be a comment if you don't want to answer it as a question.
No, I agree. And I actually found this out when I did a series of talks for the Arts Council on Black art forms. This is more than at least 10 years ago. And I think one of my favorite ones I did was one on style. And first of all, I was told style is not an art form. Why am I including it? And I said, well, of course it is. Everything about Black people is style. That's what I said. But I had these really amazing designers, and one of them being, and now I'm going to forget people's names, was Dr. Carol. She is at Chelsea School.
Carol Tullow.
Sorry? Yes.
Carol Tullow?
Carol
Tullow,
Yes, Tulloch. Yes, Carol Tulloch. Yes, Carol Tulloch led it, and she brought another couple of wonderful people. One of them was Avril Charles, and their discussion around style, and they basically, on one aspect, used Grace Jones as an icon. They said, but basically, so much fashion has come around, and so much of the progress has come around Grace Jones. But also what she was talking about was the archive work that she had to do in terms of all that style and everything, and having to go to places like Jamaica, and just saying how difficult it had been. And really, because a lot of people hadn't thought in the same way that the Arts Council didn't think the style was an art form, people didn't think that they needed to archive everything that they were doing around style. So, it's not only happening in terms of the literature field, we just don't do it. I don't know about other communities, but we just don't seem to do it a lot. We're not doing it enough, and it's really important that we do. It can be difficult because sometimes it's going to be an oral history, and the people you need to speak to don't think it's important. And I like my dad, and like the business that he did, he was one of the very few people in the country that did it, which was repairing car radiators. Repairing car radiators. There's hardly anybody who did that business. Now he's retired, and there's nothing to show that ever existed. And when I tried to grab some bits from him, it's like, oh, you should have told me. I just shredded all of that material. And he continued shredding even after I asked him, because he didn't think it was important. So yeah, we are custodians, but I hope that people find it as an enjoyable activity to do. I think would be good.
Thank you.
Is that okay, Kasewa?
Yeah, so thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Answering that question really fully, and I completely agree. Like you said, that there's no record of that ever being done, even though your dad lived a long life doing it.
Yeah.
What we think about archiving is so important. Like you say, it reminds me of, I'm going to forget her name now, the film director who made that film about Ulrich Cross.
Yes, Frances Anne Solomon.
Right, and she talks about that. She said, no one thought of him as a hero. He was a guy she knew from around the way, sort of thing.
That's right.
But he had this fantastically interesting story that told us so many other stories. But because of the way we perceive ourselves, and that's that's not just a kind of Black thing. That's more about who we think is important and the way
and who we don't. Exactly. Yeah. And he was so important to Pan-African history. People don't know about it because it was not written down. Yeah. So those people who were very much involved in the writing about that time, people don't realize it. But he was so key. He was key. As part of Pan-African history, just as much as I think Padmore was. So yeah, it gets lost. I love that film, absolutely. And I think I quoted it just because I somehow or other I made a reference to it in my thesis because I just felt it was such an important film. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. There was another hand up a moment ago. Yoshiko, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? No. Okay, well, do unmute if you do. Otherwise, you mentioned, Kadija, you sort of hinted that the MI6, and in the chat, Kelly put about the CIA apparent involvement in Flamingo. And I wondered if you could just sort of maybe expand a little bit on the politics, but also I was thinking about Was it, again, I can't remember if it was Flamingo or Tropic, that I think Claudia Jones was quite critical of the politics of as well, but then was also featured in one of those magazines. And I wondered if you can sort of speak a little bit about some of those tensions and what you think, how that was negotiated in the content in the magazines.
That's an interesting one. I hadn't seen Claudia Jones in Tropic. So, oh no, I think her history. I mean, she herself. I think it was a story about her, wasn't it? I think in Flamingo. Well, I think. I mean, well, Tropic. I don't know. Okay, it was owned by those Jamaican businessmen, and in the December issue, it's quite a buoyant issue. Like, yeah, we're doing really well. You know, we're going to be doing this from next year, that from next year, etc., etc. So you just expected it to continue, and it didn't appear. What appeared 3 months later, or it might have been longer than 3 months later, was Flamingo, which looked very much like Tropic, with Edward Scobie as editor, and but it was I think his name is Peter Thornby, was a publisher who nobody ever really saw, but there is a picture of him in one issue of Flamingo because they did this survey. And so, you know, with just the very fact that the regularity, thinking in mind that the magazines were usually irregular because of the funding, etc. Flamingo, just putting the different aspects together, you know, Flamingo continued quite solidly for 5 years. It had money to do quite a lot of things. And we were like saying, well, where did this money come from, you know, to do this? So really, was it, for example, that Flamingo bought out Tropic because you couldn't really have two of them there? And maybe they wanted to even, you know, infiltrate in terms of Tropic and try and be part of that. And they kind of like, that's not happening. So they had to really start again. I also spoke to like Val Wilmer, who's a photographer at that time, and she wrote for Tropic, and she worked on Tropic and Flamingo, you know, and she basically, you know, confirmed that the money did come from MI6 for the mag, but she didn't know it at the time. She didn't know it till a long time afterwards. And so it was very, of course, very, very well kept, but it was all done because they felt that now that the countries now that they're given independence, that they might become communist, and they were really worried about that. Because I think, as Kasera mentioned with Frances Anne Solomon, she might mention in a talk that apparently it was quite rampant and quite known that a lot of Black organizations were being spied upon during that time, especially cultural ones, because it was very easy to access them in that way. I think there's also the transcription service was also backed like by MO6. So it's kind of like, this is why when I came to make the decision about which publications I'm going to focus on, I said they had to be Black owned, because you didn't know where the money was coming from the other ones. This is why, for example, even like with Bogle Louverture with their books, they were quite adamant that they were going to raise the money themselves and within the community to publish the books. The same thing with New Beacon, because they knew where the money was coming from then. You know, we hear of things like the magazine beginning with the T, the name I can't remember, which, you know, the money came from. There were these other organizations that were set up that were filtering the money through, both here and in the US. Transition, that's it. Where all of this money was coming from, that they thought was coming from a well-meaning organization when it wasn't. And that's why, for example, T. Ras McConan didn't want to, you know, he only wanted to use his own money for the publishing company that was set up in Manchester, because again, it was like, where is this money coming from? We cannot trust these people. We only should be using our own funds to move forward and to fund what we want to do.
Absolutely, that sort of self-determination, I think, is so important to the ethos.
Exactly. So even though they wouldn't be necessarily hugely successful, it was really important for them. So they knew, and they were very wary of what was going on.
Eve has a question.
Thank you. Yeah, just first of all, it's a tremendously important point, right? What not just what was being written, but also who was being spied on, and kind of the, you know, I think people, I found when you talk about kind of the CIA links, you find that nowadays people laugh about that, but it was so real, right? and such a real threat. And I think it's really necessary to remember that history as well, that was happening in the background, because obviously, you know, the threat of having Black people communicate with each other, learn from one another, and organize, right, was seen as a real scary thing.
So
that's just something that I found really really interesting from your talk. So I don't know a huge amount about this topic, but what kind of was happening in my head was the kind of transnational solidarity ties, right? So the idea that, you know, what was happening, who were the people that were like carrying these magazines, where were they going, right? So they weren't just staying in communities, but when people were going to visit family, or going to travel to different regions and different places, this was how people communicated and got messages across. So I'd be interested in kind of mapping out in my head, more than anything, like, first of all, like how were the magazines being written? Were they being written by someone's front living room? Were they being written in newsrooms? And also then, how were they being distributed? Like, what was happening what was the movement of these publications once they got out there? And it just because something resonated, the kind of I remember once in the Caribbean, I went to visit a landfill site, and what really struck me at this landfill site was that it was filled with the paraphernalia of British tourists, right? So it was filled with their magazines. Everything that the British tourists threw away was on this landfill site in the absolute middle of nowhere in the Caribbean. And it really struck me how far these things can reach, and those and just how I don't know, it just sat really uncomfortably knowing that was kind of the end result of kind of basically en masse white tourism, right, in the region. Kind of struck me. So just it was not so much a question, but just kind of setting the scene a bit more for people like me who don't know overly kind of what was going on in the background and how these magazines were being written.
Well, I know that Tropic, they did have an office, because the businessmen, you know, they had another business. I think it was like a tailoring business or something. So that was also used as the office for the editorial office. Other magazines, yes, it was front room. Don Kinch had a great front room in his flat in Holland Road. So yeah, he didn't have to go very far. And apparently there used to be meetings there with people who became politicians, like Diane Abbott and people like that. They all used to meet in his front room. So yeah, it's very much a front room thing. And distribution as well was very much out of the back of the car thing. I spoke to Arif Ali, and he said, yeah, we would have to drive around the country distributing the papers, because the mainstream distributors, they had their marketing that didn't suit where the Black communities were, you know. And so then, you know, what you do after a month, you get all of your material back and dumped on your doorstep, but you can't sell, you know. So they would do it themselves, because they knew where their target market was, and they'd also maybe have somebody who would be like a sales rep. You know, I mean, that might have been one of the things that I'm thinking that might not have helped. For example, Tropic, maybe they tried to use a regular distribution company, and that just didn't work. But then when you look on, no, it didn't happen for Tropic. It happened with Checkers magazine, I think. Checkers, that he wrote for in the late 40s. They did try and go through mainstream distribution. There was only about 6 issues of it. Whereas when you notice in Tropic, they've got a list of these are our point of sales people, and they will be setting up their own distribution network. And in fact, we even kind of did that even in the 90s, because it was almost like it's almost impossible to get on the newsstand, because they want such exacting things that small magazines, not, you know, Black magazines can't match that. Other smaller specialist magazines can't. Whereas, believe it or not, people who produce maybe magazines on cats can, because they sell so many. So if you're not doing a cat magazine and you're not doing a lifestyle magazine, and they really are very specific distributors, because they know in terms of what's going on the newsstand. So you end up having to do it yourself. Yeah, I used to traipse around London with stacks of magazines sometimes. That's how it was. But as well, then it was kind of like done in some respects that we all knew each other, but it was a very difficult space to be in. You kind of felt that if you did break in and get a distributor, like at one stage we did with Outrage, and Time Out took it on. Time Out loved Outrage, and he basically said, you don't know the actual, you don't know what an amazing product you have here. And they took Black Arts, which was like a forerunner of their, they had the thing called the Guide. Well, Black Arts MAAS and Minority Arts and Advisory Service, we produced a Black Arts Guide, which was almost like, which proved that. The marketing guy kind of said, yeah, we copied that to do the guide. Who was to know? That's when we went to go and see him. But it wasn't something, because it was like a small arts organization, it didn't have that weight and that impact, and it didn't survive.
But essentially what you're describing to me, and what I'm hearing, is that, networks of solidarity, right, and networks of people who were being grown organically. I just think when you compare that to how far that the whole industry has changed, right, and died and had to reshape itself and become something else as well, and that's had a knock-on impact. It's completely overhauled the way that we actually communicate with each other, right, as human beings on that. And so the work that you're doing, I think, is so massively important to not just as Kessa was saying, not just to kind of reclaim that history and those voices, but also find you are the archive yourself. You are the person that is they're honoring that tradition and that material, which is just amazing. So thank you. Thanks for today. I've got a lot out of it. Really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you. So just to remind everyone that we've got a little under 10 minutes left. So if anyone does have any questions, it's one of your last opportunities. So Charles has put something in the chat. Kadija, would you like me to read that out, or?
I can read it. I didn't click on it in case I clicked on the wrong thing and everything disappeared. A very general question. When we work on literature, it's easy to think of books as self-contained units, but they very often emerge from years of collaborative initiatives. I agree. What does working on magazines tell us about the genesis of literary works of whatever genre? What does the working on magazines tell us about the genesis of literary works of whatever genre? I totally agree with the first bit of your comment, Charles. I'm just not sure I'm quite clear on what your question is asking me, if it's asking me about the books or the magazines.
Sorry, yes, it's not very clear. I'm just thinking, working on magazines, you think about books often as self-contained units. Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's a massive amount that goes into literature and so forth. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about tracing the works of literature, of poetry, as you see them and as they emerge in connected with the magazines you've been working on.
Wow, yes, that is interesting. Yeah, it's amazing. I love doing it. I suppose in some ways Staunch is a very good example of that, because they did publish a lot of creative writing. I'm working at the moment actually on a book with Benjamin Zephaniah, which is going to be like, I keep telling him it's going to be 2 volumes, which is the struggle of Black people in Britain through poetry. And he's got all of these books out of all these people who've been published this. And I said, no, we've got to go and get the poetry that's underneath people's beds. I said, because they'll be telling the story of the struggle of Black people in Britain. And that's the work is never going to be published. And it may not get to be great. It may not be great poetry, but it's going to tell so much story. So we did do a little mini tour to some cities around and collecting like pamphlets from people, for example, and people who had self-published some books. We were really trying to get things that had that were kind of were quite old, but sometimes as well, people were throwing it away. I had to do a house sit for somebody once in Leeds, and for a woman who had been a community activist, and basically her daughter just threw nearly everything in the tip. I mean, literally everything in the tip. And this woman had books and papers and everything. She had a lot of Leeds history in her house, and it went into a tip. So it's really important in some ways, even though people are kind of like, when they especially when they talk about poetry, say, oh, we only want to publish the poetry that is, that's been really well written or well edited. The stuff that hasn't been is equally important if it's telling that story of our history, and it's, I don't know. And so some of the things that I know that Benjamin and I are collecting will not go in the book, but I'm saying to him, well, maybe we need to put it somewhere. We need to archive it somehow, whether it be online or somewhere, because this is going to be a big part of our history. Did that answer your question, Charles?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a massive enterprise, and
yeah,
it's so connected in every way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And I mean, I just didn't want it to go unremarked how much of the content that you brought up, just sort of images fleetingly going past, and some of that art writing. And I mean, certainly the stuff in Tropic, some of this is really among the sort of earliest sort of Black written criticism of Black British artists. I mean, this precedes Caribbean artist movement things. There's a lot sort of, you mentioned Commonwealth Institute things, and it's just such rich history that, again, I don't feel is widely known. And
a lot
also
of the material from the Commonwealth Institute has been lost.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Which is a real shame. Yeah.
So we are almost at time now, I'm afraid, and I know Eve needs to come in to wrap things up. But Kadija, can I also invite you if there's anything else you'd like to plug? Because it was great to hear about the book with Benjamin and Zephaniah. I think that will be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, when we finish it. But I must just say, we've actually had really great support from Leicester University and their mentors, because they have a mentoring program of some of their students in their final year, working with transcultural publishers. They only work with small independent Black and Asian publishers. And so for about the past 4 years, well, I've been working with them for about 10 years. In the past 4 years, I've been having some of them work on the book, which has been amazing. So it will come out. But Africa Writes Exeter, I think some of it is online as well, starts on Friday, and I'm taking part in that. So that's going to be quite fun. And I'm going to be like reading some poetry and actually talking about my Afri Poetry app and interviewing a writer whose book I'm now going to go and read. So that's kind of what I'm doing next. Oh, and as well, I should mention there's going to be a conference in July at Brighton University of Black and Asian women writers. July the 21st to the 23rd. It's they did one 10 years ago, so this is the one following. We decided we'd make it women only. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, if I can just also invite everyone just to say a huge thank you for an absolutely amazing talk as we now hand over to Eve to close.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. A huge thank you to both of you, to Kadija and Nick, for a fantastic session. Just to say on behalf of CLACS and IMLR, thank you everyone for attending these sessions over the past year. My colleague Jack Webb and I have had an absolute blast. It's been incredibly an incredibly enriching experience to collaborate with so many amazing people. So please don't forget, if you want to join us from September, I'll be working over the summer putting the schedule together, so just reach out in any way, shape or form if you want to join us, or if you've got any suggestions, or if you want to kind of get more involved, just get in touch. And that's it from me, so thank you.